It was on this day in 2013 that demonstrators came out onto Kyiv's main Maidan Square to protest against the government's decision to scrap plans for closer ties with the European Union. Known as the Maidan Revolution of Dignity, the 3 months of protests were marked by violent confrontations with security services in which more than 100 people were killed.
One of the heroes that was killed by a sniper used his body to cover me and save my life.
10 years ago on this day, people realized that the government did not want to make the changes we wanted.
Raheem, you have the distinction of being someone who was actually there at the initial Maidan protests when this entire revolution kicked off all the way back in 2013, because there's so many people that I see commenting on this situation, the dust-up between J.D. Vance, President Trump, and Zelensky, that don't realize that this was a decade plus in the making. Walk me through your new piece.
Yeah, God, you and I talk about this all the time, Jack, both on air and off. And it's so frustrating to me because, having been on the ground in 2014, having made the decision to go out to Kiev during those protests to see what it was all about, to actually investigate, ask some questions about what's going on here, who's behind this, who's involved in it. You can still find some of my original reporting back from Breitbart London. I was reviewing it the other day, and that's what really caused me to write this piece. A lot of your audience members will know, and you know, Jack, that I don't often feel compelled to write. I need to feel that compulsion in order to produce a good work. I don't think you should just write for the sake of writing. And I started to go back and I looked at this Steve Saylor essay from back at the beginning of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then watched the Man Who Would Be King, the Rudyard Kipling book turned movie, and it all kind of came together in that moment for me this weekend. I started to look at how the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and of course you mentioned in the last block Sir Keir Starmer, the U.K. foreign policy establishment also. And I've called it this for a long time. In fact, Newsweek edited this phrase out of my column in 2022. I call it white Iraq, right? Ukraine, for a long time now. And the reason being is because it's exactly how you concluded in the last block. This is their lifeblood, right? Like, blood is their lifeblood for the defense industry, for the foreign policy establishment, for all of this. And, I'm kind of sick of having to hear these people opine about what success on the foreign stage looks like when, and I can't scream this loudly enough, they are the ones who presided over the last 20 years of foreign policy failures, right? They are the men who would be king, as Kipling wrote it, and this farce that they have run around the world, not just failing to solve problems, pretending like they're trying to solve problems, but actually causing more problems. And you see today what happens. Putin comes out and he says, you know what? I can actually help negotiate between the United States and Iran on the nuclear stuff too. So boom, here we are, how many days into the admin? And we've already got a number of foreign policy victories under the president's belt. So that all caused, the compulsion for me in writing this thing. I encourage everybody to read it. Obviously I would, but it gives a history and a background and a context and thematics to this that I desperately think is missing. Jack, I've had liberal reporters reaching out to me. I've had moderates from my home country in the UK, and I've had people all the way up, into the high levels of the US government reach out to me and say, we loved your piece. We thought it was so intelligent, and I'm not trying to brag about this at all. I want people to understand this information because this is actionable information. These are the types of arguments that you should be having with people. And those are the type of things that lead to that moment in the Oval Office last week, right? Why did JD say and behave the way he did? Because it's not a new spat that we're having here. It's an entirely new doctrine.
That's exactly right. And so the way that I've looked at it, it's what's interesting, though, I guess I would argue, is that it's in fact a reversion to the previous doctrine. It's a reversion to the pre-1990s doctrine that just about every country around the world held, as well as all the great, and specifically all the great powers. So what you're looking at here, the great statesmen, Metternich of Europe, and then, even when people talked about people say what they want about Nixon today, but people really do credit him on his foreign policy, engineering the visit to China, which set up the Sino-Soviet split. What this would be a remanufacturing of a Sino-Soviet split, but in reverse. So the Sino-Soviet split was during the Cold War. These two major powers, the Soviet Union and China, were joined at the hip, two communist countries, but Nixon and Kissinger were able to peel them away and then pit them against each other as they are natural competitors. What this would essentially, because look at it, folks, basic game of chess, if you were up against two other major powers, would you want them ganging up against you, or would you want to try to get them to fight each other? So the idea then being is peel the Russians away from the Chinese. It doesn't mean embracing them. It doesn't mean justifying them. It means being smart and being realistic. And that's exactly what J.D. Vance was talking about.
Yeah, look, it's almost like he understands, actual geopolitics. Right, so Halford Mackinder and Mahan and all these things that we talk about over and over, it's almost like he is the grown-up in the room. And again, let me put my UK hat on for this, because a lot of people are, oh my goodness, we're now fighting with the Brits. How could this ever happen? Unprecedented, blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry, but Ronald Reagan refused to back our literal war in the Falklands while Margaret Thatcher was prime minister, and those two were inseparable. And Trump's not Reagan, but Sir Keir Starmer is certainly no Thatcher. So the idea that this is somehow, new and unprecedented, and we've never seen disagreements between allies and friends and partners abroad before, is an absolute nonsense. And you should disregard the words of anybody who tells you differently. Forget about it. They're children. They have no historical context for what they're saying. And Jack, what you just mentioned is perhaps the most important part of all of this, right? For those of us who are looking 10, 15, 20 years down the pike, the driving the wedge between Russia and China is the single most important thing this administration could possibly do. If you do not achieve that, if you do not do that, you will end up with foreign policy like Obama's, which is trying to put out fires around the world, but putting them out with gasoline. And that's what he did, and that's what happened with Crimea, and that's what happened with the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's what happened with Iran, and so on and so forth. And we are still, President Trump, God bless him, is still putting out Barack Obama's fires.